Let's talk.
John Brown.
Contested Commons, a history of protest in public space in England, is a radical history of the country itself, telling a long story of contests over Trafalgar Square, Hyde Park, Cable Street, etc., etc. It is the work of a fascinating new book by Katrina Navickas, and I'm delighted to say that Katrina joins us live on the line now. Good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Tell me a little bit about yourself, how you're eminently qualified to write this book. Because I should be Prof, shouldn't it? Prof Katrina.
Nah, we're all informal as historians. So, yeah, I'm a professor of history at the University of Hertfordshire in the UK, and I study the history of protest and demonstrations, strikes, riots, anything that gets people out on the streets.
Fair enough. So are we talking sort of some of the things that I mentioned, obviously, Cable Street, Trafalgar Square, Hyde Park. Are we talking about sort of in post-industrial revolution? We're not going back to sort of Wat Tyler and having a crack at Richard II, are we?
No, I start in the early 19th century with the rise of public space in urban areas.
Right.
So where does this idea of public space come from? Where does the modern protest come from? They emerged together in the early 19th century with this new idea of democracy, the people. So people claim public space. They want to be part of open space, the people. Claiming new sites, new areas.
Here's a thought just struck me, and it does occasionally. Because you were building industrial towns, Dark Satanic Mills, William Blake, etc. But the idea of a public space, because previously common ground has been where you graze your sheep and whatever. But these are, you've got a bandstand, you've maybe got a pond and a few ducks. It's sort of that sort of early Victorian, late Georgian idea of, the little people need somewhere to sort of rest their weary legs before they are, put back slaving away at the age of 12 in cotton mills. But of course, this is perhaps a byproduct. They don't think about this because if they hadn't built public spaces, there would be nowhere for them to protest. And if they did, it would be outside of the towns, and therefore it could be quite easily dealt with.
Yeah, indeed. So we see that what's called enclosure in this period. So those open spaces, those commons, are fenced off, turned into squares or streets or buildings, and new types of public space are invented, such as the public parks. So the public parks are Victorian invention. So as you said, the bandstand, the promenade, but these are enclosed spaces. You have a park warden who tells you what to do, tells you not to sit there or stop loitering. You also have the rise of the police in the 19th century who tell you what to do on the street. So there's lots of new rules about how to use open spaces and who can use them, who is the public in public space. If you're loitering around looking like you're doing no good, then you can be told to move on.
So when do people start taking this? Presumably because of the UK's wonderful climate. Normally these meetings are going to be, any sort of protest meeting is held within a hall. I don't know, Temperance Hall, a church, whatever you want to call it. Presumably, if you've got a bandstand, or you can put your soapbox up, and we still see that at Hyde Park, like Speakers' Corners every day. But who are the first people to latch on that these are places? Not so much. Is it a preaching situation, or is it the sort of the nascent trade union movement that starts, and this is a good open space that people can express their views?
Yeah, so you obviously have political meetings in halls and chapels or indoor spaces, but the point of modern democracy is that you try and get as many people involved as possible. So you want a big demonstration, you want the largest space possible. So squares and parks and these spaces that allow you lots of space, I keep saying that word today, are used by political movements, the rise of the democratic movement. So we see the Chartists in the 1840s, and then you get the women's suffrage movement later on in the 19th century. And as you said, trade unions, they all want to claim spaces that are generally controlled by the elites, owned by big landowners. The police are trying to tell them what to do. So it's a contest of who can use that space in what ways. What can you say? What is freedom of speech in an open space?
I mean, and again, the other thing I suppose is these are organised, but nowadays, if you wish to have a protest, you have to let the police know, let the town hall know, because it's got to be stewarded, the whole thing. Late 1800s, that's not a situation, or is it? Or are these more spontaneous? And if so, are these demonstrations, or these and it's not just green spaces. It can be a square like Trafalgar Square. Are these to keep people on their toes, as it were? And if so, does that sort of explain why notoriously in several cases the authorities crack down heavily? They bring in the bleeding cavalry at some points.
Yeah. So, you do need permission to hold a meeting or demonstration. So you have to ask the police, or the magistrates quite often are in control in the towns. But when there's periods of fear of revolution, that's when the authorities crack down. So we do have lots of history of peaceful meetings in the 19th, 20th century. But when there's fear that the working class are going to become a mob or become revolutionary. So 1819 is a big date for me. So I'm from near Manchester. So that's where the Peterloo massacre happened in 1819, where the magistrates sent the cavalry in to put down a peaceful demonstration that was campaigning for the vote. They were fearful that it was a revolutionary time. We'd just had the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. So this idea of democracy is still seen as a bad thing in the 19th century by most of the politicians and elites. So that's why a lot of these demonstrations are put down. Again, there's fears of trade unions combining. So there's another famous incident in 1887 in Trafalgar Square in London, where the Metropolitan Police clamped down, ban all meetings for many years, actually, in Trafalgar Square, which is, I think, most important because it's seen as the national political space. It's politically significant.
What's also interesting is the Peterloo. I always get that wrong. Peterloo. Yeah,
it's a play on Waterloo.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, because that takes place 4 years after Waterloo. So the cavalry who charged down the protesters, and you think Waterloo is always written in the narrative of this great British victory against the Napoleonic forces, discovering that we wouldn't become a dictatorship, etc., etc., etc. And yet, 48 months later, they are killing innocent protesters on the streets of a major urban city.
Yeah, definitely. And there's probably ex-soldiers in the crowd demanding the vote. So it's seen as a big massacre. It's called a massacre. There's about 18 people died, about 750 killed. But it just leads to more restrictions on protests. The government see it as, needing to pass legislation to stop these large meetings happening in the big squares in industrial cities. So it takes a long time for people to get the vote. It's not till 1832 that they change the system to get places like Manchester MPs, but it's not until after the First World War that we get democracy as we now know it.
Cable Street, the Battle of the Battle of Cable Street. That's an interesting one because it's Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists, and I was about to swear then fascism, but it's interesting because the narrative, what actually happens there with the police fighting because it ends up with the police fighting Mosley's black shirts. Is that correct? Rather than, but it's in the myth, it's become like there are some scuffles, but it's not the working class taking on Mosley's thugs.
It's the communities in the East End, which are mainly Jewish. So it's them defending their territory, essentially. They're defending where they live against these quite provocative marches. Yeah. So the whole debate is about, do Mosley's movement have the right to march through different areas? Do you have the right to hold a march wherever you like? And the police are worried about breaches of the peace. They're worried about people fighting back, which they do fight back. There's also communist groups involved, so it's fascists versus communists versus the community versus the police. So it's all quite contested space over, do you have the right to march? So what the government does quite quickly afterwards is pass the first Public Order Act, 1936, which tries to regulate these marches. It gives the police powers to ban marches, but actually most of the time you can as long as you get permission, you can still march, but it's trying to make sure that there's not public order breaches and that people are safe.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things is going on from that is if we look at, because then obviously, you know, cometh the war and everything, I suppose everybody has to buckle down and toe the line, you know, because they are literally fighting fascism. But then we get, and I'm going to leap around here, so bear with me on this one, Katrina, because I mean, I'm thinking big protests are going to take place then are going to be things like anti-Vietnam, Grosvenor Square in 1968 and there is outside the American Embassy. And again, we get that whole thing about the British Bobby, however, it is violent out there, not on the scale of, say, Kent State, you know, if it's going to happen in 1970 in Ohio, but still, I don't think genteel, middle-class British people in Staffordshire having their cups of tea are going to see this sort of, literally sort of street fighting that's the sort of thing the French get up to in the summer of 68.
Yeah, there's some great photographs of the anti-Vietnam protesters pulling down the fences round Grosvenor Square. So they're protesting because, again, it's a really symbolic site. It's outside the American Embassy, so they're claiming that space. But, again, the police's role is to keep public order, so the police have to use different tactics. So I've looked at some documents in the Home Office records and the police records at the National Archives, and they develop new strategies for policing crowds. They developed things called the wedge, and it's basically the start of kettling and different tactics to control large crowds in quite enclosed spaces like squares that are surrounded by buildings. It's also the first time that they start thinking about new forms of surveillance. So this is the kind of Cold War era. So there's the first CCTV is installed to try and monitor these 1968 demonstrations. They put them on the tops of the roofs around Grosvenor Square and around Trafalgar Square, but they're not complete. It's not like a surveillance state because these are really expensive cameras. It's about £7,000 in 1960s money, to install a camera. So the police are putting a lot of resources into surveillance as well, but it's not complete. It's not total. We're not living in a kind of dictatorial state in the 1960s in Britain. Still got a lot of freedom.
I mean, when I grew up being aware, you know, in the 70s as of the Anti-Nazi League and the National Front, and you know the killing of Blair Peach. How much are we seeing at this point the right to protest? Because obviously, you know, we have the Rock Against Racism happening in Finsbury Park. Great stuff indeed. But do we get to a point where the police or the government say, well, okay, you have the right to protest, however, and you know, the same old news thing, you know, do you have the right to protest right next to a group who is on, and obviously you're putting, you know, petrol on an already incendiary situation. So is it sort of the late 70s when we have the Anti-Nazi League against the National Front, that's when it starts to, the police start to say you can't have that that protest?
Yeah, the crisis point is really late 70s, early 1980s with all these groups. It is mainly around race. It's National Front against black communities in London and Liverpool and Birmingham. And it's also the rise of football hooliganism as well, which becomes a real problem, public order, which I know isn't protest, but takes up a lot of police resources. So we see sort of it climaxing really with the miners' strike in the 1984-85. I mean, do striking workers have the right to protest? Again, becomes a big key issue. So Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s developed much more comprehensive public order legislation that gives police a lot more powers to ban protests, clamp down on protests. They're tackling the far right, they're tackling football hooliganism, they're tackling striking miners. A whole load of different types of protests are happening in that era. So it's really, really a key issue for the government and for the police. Because
you've got the flying pickets, and that's not a group, you know, but secondary picketing, and also you've got, because the actual equipment the police are wearing at that point then changes. Yeah. So you look at something from, I don't know, a Notting Hill riot in the late 70s, and they've all got the distinctive London Bobby helmet, which is kind of, I'm not saying if you're being hat on by a member of Her Majesty Constabulary. It's nice and friendly, but it's that old Bobby on the beat. And then you get Orgreave, and you've got Mount again, and here we go, cavalry again, with people with crash hats on, with high, with shields. And it's like the reason that Orgreave sticks in the national psyche, I think, is the fact that that's the first time people will remember seeing that, and then they'll see it again at the poll tax riots, which is, and that comes out of left field, because I was talking to, because that's my generation, and I'm talking to people who are over there and they've gone shopping for the day, and suddenly near Trafalgar Square they get caught up in this whirlwind of protest and violence. Yeah,
it's much more authoritarian from the police point of view. They're really trying to crack down on these big issues. I think it is part of government strategy to try and, in the 1980s, to try and clamp down on all these different types of protest. The government, certainly Thatcher's government in the 1980s, very concerned about protecting property, protecting private businesses. And so those are the kind of targets that they get, that they get quite severe on. And you do see that famous photograph, the Battle of Orgreave, with the policeman on a horse hitting one of the protesters. It becomes a kind of this is the era of mass media as well, so people are seeing this in places that they're very far away from the protest, but they see the police brutality through the media as well.
Yeah, and then we sort of move, and so far we've talked about anti-Nazi League, racism. We talked about, obviously, miners' strike, the miners and political things there. But in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, as well as that, because I'm of that generation, we're going raving, and we're heading. We're on the N20. You smiled then. We hit the M25 and go and have these big raves in the middle of nowhere without mobile phones. Kids, ask your parents. And this is they're also it's the time of the new age, and the crusties in the vans, and this is seen as a huge threat. Environmental, Swampy in his tree, etc. And the media crack down on this as if it's the Armageddon, and what we suddenly see is the police collectively basically kind of get sweeping powers and lose their collective minds, you could argue, because you get a bunch of people who are protesting the environment, not since Greenham Common, you get a bunch of party girls who just want to go home after a night out, and they're caught in this sort of this wedge. And that is an interesting one as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and when I've looked through the archives of the Met Police and the government in National Archives, all these groups get lumped together and literally in boxes in the archives. So you've got a box on striking miners, and then you get a box on new travellers who are having raves in the countryside, and they're all in the same categories. So the government lumps anyone together who's mobile, who's in the countryside where they think they shouldn't be, who are making noise in the countryside. So that infamous clause in the 1994 Criminal Justice Bill about repetitive beats, and it's anyone who's not seen as part of that kind of stable, propertied, conservative society. So anyone living in an alternative life. So, new travellers and ravers and hunt saboteurs and anti-roads protesters all get lumped together, even though they are quite separate groups sometimes. And they're the ones who are actually going back to the commons. So the theme of my book is around this idea of people creating a commons. Yeah. And so we start with the commons being enclosed in the 19th century. We end with these ravers or these anti-roads protesters camping out on Castle Morton Common in 1992, trying to claim those spaces as their own as well for a different type of lifestyle. And that's what gets legislated against in those public order acts in 86 and 1994. And the police clamped down on quite severely.
And one of the ones, the most shocking, I don't know if you cover it in the book, but Sever Everard's, the protests on Clapham Common. I mean, of all the things to have a heavy-handed police approach, that is perhaps the most unexplainable. I mean, and that is in the middle of metropolitan London. It is surrounded by, women who are, they're in no way are they firebrands. It's the most shocking and disgusting case that I think many of us have had to cover in decades. And yet the response, I don't know who authorised the response, but it's taking place on Clapham, a common in South London, in full glare of social media and the quote unquote mainstream media, and that is one that again can highlight and shocks people who think that we have moved on from those dark days of the 60s and 70s, or even the 1860s and the 1870s.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that protest happened during a lot of the lockdown restrictions. So part of the pandemic lockdown restrictions was to stop people meeting in public spaces. And the government were really concerned about demonstrations. So we see the Black Lives Matter demonstrations like the few months before then. So the tearing down of the Colston statue in Bristol where they throw it into the harbour. And the protests on Clapham Common around the vigil for Sarah Everard really sort of encapsulated, I think, the confusion in government policy over, what do you do in a pandemic situation over the right to free speech, the right to assemble. And I think that really encapsulated the fact that people had gone over the line. They'd gone too far in terms of how do you police something that was a peaceful protest, a peaceful vigil. Really, really crucial time, I think, for testing what was allowed and what wasn't allowed in terms of meeting.
So, what should we be looking? The book Contested Commons. Because a lot of people just go, oh well, the common is just there because it's a nice space, and perhaps we can have an espresso bar there, and something, and a real juice bar and a farmer's market. Then shudder. But I mean, there are, it's a public space, and we should look at the ways that it was envisioned to be used, and the way that people should be able to use commons. I'm not saying that you should be able to have a protest every day, but then again, it's a common space. What's the, if you like, the genesis or the central concept of the book?
The central concept is that we have this idea of public space. We have the idea of the commons, that it belongs to everyone, but actually it's always been contested. Government has always tried to regulate what we can do in public spaces, and actually most of land in England and Wales certainly is privately owned. So even that commons, that open space that you want to have a picnic on, it's not belonging to you. It belongs to a private landowner. It might be the council, but it might be a private landowner. So all the way through history, people have claimed open spaces, claimed to be a commons, claimed to be a public, but actually there's always been restrictions and contests over who can use what spaces.
What's the aim? Is it to raise awareness amongst people about the fact that this is public land and we should be able to use it how we want to? I mean, is it history? Is that the main thrust of the book?
Yeah, and appreciate that people have protested for your right to assemble, your right to have free speech, your right to do what you want, really. But there's always been laws and regulations around what you can do. So especially now, certainly there's a big debate over the commercialisation of public space, particularly in parks. So you see private events organisers holding festivals or private events that are ticketed in a park and close off the space for quite a long time for local residents can't get into the local park. So there's those issues around the privatisation of public space, how it's policed, who can use what spaces. Those are still issues today that we still have to think about and deal with.
The book is called Contested Commons, A History of Protest and Public Space in England. It's by Katrina Navickas, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. Katrina, Professor Katrina, if people want to find you online and say nice things to you and help support you, where's the best place to find you?
So my website is historyofpublicspace.uk, and it has all the info on it there.
And you can order the book via our own virtual bookstore. Just click on the front cover and it'll be winging its way to you. The book is called Contested Commons. It's by Professor Katrina Navickas. It's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you this morning.
Great chat. Thank you.